In the 19th century, after the transfer of 3 Kazakh Zuzes to the Russian Empire, the so-called Great Game began, which was a geopolitical rivalry between the Russian and British empires for control of Central Asia. The Russian Empire planned to include the states of Central Asia in its structure in order to stop raids on its border territories, as well as gain access to Asian goods such as cotton. In turn, the British did their best to prevent the appearance of Russian troops on the borders of their Indian possessions. To solve this problem, the British needed to establish control over Central Asia, or at least turn its rulers against the Russian Empire. The transition in 1812 of the senior Kazakh Zuz to the citizenship of the Russian Empire caused a hostile reaction from the Khanate of Kokand, since earlier the senior Zuz was in the sphere of influence of this Khanate. The first clashes between Russian detachments and the troops of the Khanate of Kokand began in 1850, but they were of a local nature. Soon the situation changed. Already in 1851, a Russian detachment under the command of Colonel Karbashev, with the support of the allied Kazakhs, crossed the Ili River and approached the Tochebek fortress. Having learned about the approach of the Russian detachment, the local garrison left the fortress. Having destroyed the fortress left by the enemy, the Russian army seriously undermined the influence of the Khanate of Kokand in the Seven Rivers region. Over the next few years, Russian detachments continued to destroy the fortified outposts of the Khanate of Kokand. In 1853, a Russian detachment of 2,000 soldiers under the command of Peravsky, with the support of 500 Kazakhs, advanced towards the AK Mosque. Having reached the outskirts of the city on July 3, 1853, the Russians began siege work. After the completion of the siege work, the assault on the AK Mosque began, as a result of which the city fell into the hands of the Russians. During 1853, the Kokand people made attempts to return the lost city, but all of them were unsuccessful. After the occupation of the AK Mosque, the Russians did not take active steps, since the Crimean War began at that time. The forces of the Khanate of Kokand also did not try to attack the Russians, so at that time there was internal unrest in the Khanate. In 1860, the Kokand Khan gathered a large army in the hope of regaining control over Seven Rivers region, but this attempt was unsuccessful. In the Uzun-Agach battle, the Kokand army was defeated by Russian detachments and the allied Kazakh cavalry. In the summer of 1864, the Russian army again began active operations. A detachment of 2,000 soldiers under the command of Verevkin advanced towards the city of Turkestan. The garrison of the city, realizing that they were unable to hold back the onslaught of the Russian detachments, hastily retreated to Tashkent. In September 1864, another Russian detachment under the command of Cherniv advanced towards Shymkent and, having reached the city, after a short siege, occupied it. Trying to capitalize on the success of the Russian detachment of 1,550 people advanced towards Tashkent and made an attempt to capture the city. Russian artillery succeeded in destroying the gates of the city, but faced with a numerically superior garrison, which offered fierce resistance on the city streets, the Russians had to stop the assault and return to Shymkent. In December 1864, Olenko, who was the de facto ruler of the Khanate of Kokand, decided to strike back. He left Tashkent at the head of an army of 10,000 soldiers, intending to go behind Russian lines and occupy the city of Turkestan. Near the village of Ikin, Olenko's army collided with 100 Cossacks under the command of Yasal Sarev, who managed to take up a circular defense. The battle lasted 2 days. In the end, the Cossacks managed to break out of the encirclement by lining up in a square. Since the surprise factor was lost, Olenko was forced to abandon the attack on Turkestan and return to Tashkent. On April 29, 1865, the Russian army under the command of Cherniv began a campaign against Tashkent. On May 9, near the Kara-Su tract, Russian detachments clashed with the army of Olenko. As a result of a bloody battle, the army of the Kokand Khanate was defeated, and Olenko himself died in battle. Very soon, Cherniv's detachments began the siege of Tashkent, and on June 17, as a result of a 3-day assault, the Russians captured the city. After the occupation of Tashkent, the positions of the Russian army improved, but at the same time, the Russians had a new enemy in the person of the Bukhara Emirate. The fact is that immediately after the Russians occupied Tashkent, the Emir of Bukhara invaded Kokand and restored Kadoyer to the Khan's throne, who had previously been overthrown by Alimkal. Immediately after this, the Emir of Bukhara began to assemble an army in order to strike at the rear of the Russian troops at a decisive moment. The plans of the Emir of Bukhara did not become a secret for the Russian command. To get rid of the threat from the Bukhara Emirate, on May 8, 1866, Russian troops attacked the Bukhara army near the city of Urjar. Rapidly advancing on a numerically superior enemy, the Russians managed to put him to flight, which allowed them to concentrate on the fight against the Khanate of Kokand. On May 17, the Russian army reached the fortress of Kokand and began to besiege it on May 25. As a result of a swift assault, Kokand fell into the hands of the Russians. In order to build on the success, the Russian army continued the offensive, thanks to which in July the Russian detachments managed to occupy the cities of Uratubi, and in October the strongest fortress in Turkestan, Zizak, fell into the hands of the Russians. The Kokand Khanate continued to resist, but in 1868 Kadoyer Khan was forced to sign an agreement recognizing the dependence of the Khanate of Kokand on the Russian Empire. On May 1, 1868, a Russian detachment of about 3,000 soldiers gathered near the Zizak fortress began to move toward Samarkand. Having reached the outskirts of Samarkand, the Russian detachments encountered the Bukhara army of about 40,000 soldiers, which took up positions on the Chupanata heights. The Russians lined up in two columns and began crossing the Zarafshan River, planning to attack the enemy positions. Unable to withstand the onslaught of the Russian detachments, the Bukhara army abandoned its positions and fled from the battlefield. In turn, the residents of Samarkand did not let the fleeing Bukhara troops into the city, and the next day they opened the gates of the Russian army. Some time later, on May 30, leaving a small garrison in Samarkand, the Russian army left the city, planning to overtake and defeat the Bukhara army. Very soon after General Kaufman left Samarkand, a large force of Bukharans gathered in the vicinity of the city. A small Russian garrison, knowing full well that it would not be able to protect the walls of the city from superior enemy forces, retreated to the citadel and took up defense. On June 2, the Bukharians broke into the city and very soon occupied it and tried to attack the citadel. On the same day, General Kaufman defeated the army of the Emir on the Zarabulak Heights, who was forced to recognize dependence on the Russian Empire and undertake to pay a military reward of 500,000 rubles. Meanwhile, the Bukharians continued to attack the citadel of Samarkand. On June 7, the Russian garrison received word that General Kaufman was rushing to their aid. The Bukharians also learned about the imminent arrival of Russian troops, who on June 8 hastily left Samarkand and dispersed, ceasing active resistance. In 1873, the Russian army of 13,000 soldiers under the command of General Kaufman began a campaign against the Khanate of Khiva. The army was divided into several detachments, which were supposed to start moving from Zizak, as well as from the shores of the Caspian Sea. Already on May 28, a part of the Russian army under the command of General Verevkin approached the city of Khiva and immediately occupied a defensive rampart located near the city walls. Khan, knowing full well that he would not be able to repulse the Russian attack, sent a delegation to General Kaufman, who had not yet managed to get to Khiva, planning to negotiate the terms of surrender. On May 29, Verevkin demanded that the defenders of the city surrender the Shah Abat gates, but the commander of the Khiva garrisons, who expected that after the completion of negotiations, General Kaufman would enter the city through the Kazarasp gates open to him, refused to comply with Verevkin's demands. Having received a refusal, the Russians occupied the gate by force, making a gap in them with the help of 2 artillery pieces. Thus, while General Kaufman was preparing for the solemn entry into Khiva, most of the city was already occupied by Verevkin's detachment. Meanwhile, the Khan of Khiva fled the city, planning to continue the fight against the Russians, but returned on June 2 and signed an agreement recognizing vassal dependence on the Russian Empire. Despite the fact that the Khiva oasis came under the control of Russian troops almost without a fight, many Turkmens refused to recognize the power of the Russian Empire. The Turkmens, who only nominally obeyed the Khan, were able to gather a large army of up to 20,000 soldiers and did not plan to surrender without a fight. In 1875, an uprising broke out in the Khanate of Kokand, led by Abdurrahman Avtabachi. Very soon, the eldest son of the Khan, Nasruddin Khan, joined the rebels. Already in July 1875, the rebels managed to capture Kokand, after which the second son of Khan Alambek joined them. Khan Kadoyer himself fled to Kokand under the protection of the Russian troops. Nasruddin was proclaimed the new Khan, who decided to try to recapture all the lands of the Khanate of Kokand occupied by the Russians. After some time, the army of the Kokand Khanate reached the vicinity of Kokand and on August 8, 1875 besieged the city. It was not possible to take the city before the arrival of reinforcements of the Kokand army, commanded by Abdurrahman Avtabachi, and he had to retreat from Kokand. The Russian army, having reached Kokand, began to pursue the retreating enemy. Having overtaken the Kokand people near the Maram fortress, the Russians defeated the enemy army and continued the offensive. On August 29, the city of Kokand was occupied without a fight, and Nasruddin Khan surrendered. Continuing the offensive, the Russian troops occupy Marjalan. Finding himself in a hopeless situation, Nasruddin Khan was forced to recognize himself as a vassal of the Russian Empire and undertake to pay an annual tribute of 500,000 rubles, as well as cede all the lands north of the city of Narin. As soon as the Russian troops left Kokand, an uprising broke out again in the Khanate. Abdurrahman Avtabachi overthrew Nasruddin Khan, who was forced to flee under the protection of the Russian army to Kokand. Pulut Bek was appointed the new Khan. Abdurrahman Avtabachi concentrated his army in the city of Andizan. Having learned about another uprising in the Khanate of Kokand, the Russian army of about 3,000 soldiers under the command of General Skobelev advanced towards the city of Andizan. On January 8, the Russians reached the outskirts of the city and began to shell it with artillery. Understanding the futility of resistance, Abdurrahman Avtabachi surrendered to the Russian army on January 28, 1876. After the occupation of Andizan, the Russian army occupied Kokand without meeting resistance. On February 19, in order to avoid the emergence of new uprisings, the Khanate of Kokand was included in the Russian Empire. In January 1880, the Russian army under the command of General Skobelev launched the Akhal-Teke expedition to force the Turkmens to accept citizenship of the Russian Empire. The expedition turned out to be quite successful, and by the end of January, the Russian troops, after a bloody assault, managed to occupy the Jik-Tepe fortress. Developing success, the Russian detachments occupied Askabad and the adjacent territories. Merv remained the only restless city in the region. At the end of 1883, a message was sent to this city with a proposal to voluntarily transfer to Russian citizenship. Already on January 25, 1884, envoys from the inhabitants of Merv arrived in Askabad, who declared that they agreed to voluntarily become subjects of the Russian Empire. Thus Merv was occupied by Russian troops without a fight. By the end of the 19th century, the Russian Empire established control over all of Central Asia, but at the same time, the Khanate of Khiva and the Emirate of Bukhara, having fallen into vassalage, retained their statehood. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to my channel and click on the bell so as not to miss new videos.